But one of the things in the middle of MKUltra that gets discussed a lot that I think you went into in your book, I got to find out when I read it, but we were at least talking off air a little bit about it, was the whole hippie movement and like the time that this was going on, because you know, you had like the Great Awakening happening in the 60s, the countercultural movement, rock music, peace, love, and drugs, like the whole bit. And a lot of the, let's say, the vibe or politics of the hippies and the people there were more along the lines of, say, Marxist, which is not a perfect way of putting it, but at least like if you were from the traditional US standpoint, that's how they looked at these people. And, Tom O'Neill wrote this pretty unbelievable book that was 20 years in the making when he put it out, called Chaos. And people have heard that Rogan podcast. He's been on Danny Jones and other shows as well since then. But, essentially he started with this investigation that was supposed to be, I think he was going to work on it for 3 months. It was supposed to be a piece just commemorating the 30-year murder for Esquire magazine or something, the 30-year anniversary of the Manson murders. And it turned into this whole thing where he basically was like destitute for a while even, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and became this book, and he probably has another book in him. But part of what he seemed to get at, when there were a lot of different pieces to this, was that Manson was maybe linked to MKUltra, and that the CIA and government organizations wanted to basically infiltrate the peace and love hippie movement because they were concerned about the political ramifications of something like that getting out of control. Did you look at any of this in your investigation related to MKUltra?
Yeah, I have a chapter on Jolly West, who was in charge of one of the sub-projects, and he's the main guy that Tom O'Neill says was involved in either doing some kind of experiments with Manson or on Manson or something like that. So I have a chapter on Jolly West. I didn't look really into Manson myself because he already has that book, and that's not really the thrust of my book. I only have one chapter to do this, and so that didn't become a big part of mine.
Can you tell everyone about Jolly West who's not familiar?
Yes, Jolly West is this. He's this psychiatrist who was working at Lackland Air Force Base. He was the guy, I think I mentioned at the beginning of this, that was interviewing these servicemen who were prisoners of war in Korea and trying to determine whether they were being mind controlled or something else. Tom O'Neill makes the connection that Jolly Weston later in his career went to UCLA, and he was doing some experiments over there. Jolly West had this connection with Sidney Gottlieb. They have this correspondence that's in Jolly West's paper at UCLA. Gottlieb goes under a pseudonym in the correspondence, Sherman Grifford, but it's Sidney Gottlieb. And West says that I would love to do some experiments, and MKUltra starts funding him to do some of these. A lot of it's like hypnotism experiments, trying to implant false memories, something like that. And O'Neill tries to make this connection between West and Manson. They were kind of at similar locations at about the same time. I like his book for a couple reasons, and I don't like it for one reason.
Okay.
But the writing is phenomenal. And here, the best part about the book to me, content aside, I love gonzo journalism where it's the person there doing the thing. I'm reading his story of how he came to find out about this. I love like the behind the scenes.
Yes.
Let's get into the archives. Let's tell me about the interviews, how they went, how you found this person. He does such a good job of that, telling his own story of finding out about this. So that was my favorite part of the book. The second part of the book is it's kind of 3 different books. That's one book. The next part is about Manson, like the Manson murders. And there was a previous book about the Manson murders, Helter Skelter, by this guy Bugliosi. And Tom O'Neill
writes about a lot.
Yeah, he kind of takes that apart, saying, Bugliosi is saying that Manson did this because he wanted to spark a race war and all this stuff. But O'Neill picks that apart and says that's not what's happening here.
Bugliosi was crazy, man. He was a demented guy.
Yeah, and the third part of the book is O'Neill making this, or trying to make this connection between Jolly West and Manson. Maybe Manson was involved in this some way. Maybe he was a victim of one of these experiments. Maybe that led him to do certain things or manipulate certain people. Maybe he learned how to do something from this. I don't really see that. O'Neill himself admits in the book that he never really found the smoking gun evidence that these two people ever interacted or around each other. They're kind of in the same place. It's possible that they did. But again, for me, possible, something about that word just doesn't sit right. In history, I always try to stay away from words like maybe, probably, might be, could be, should be, possibly. Those are unsure words, and I want to be sure of what I'm saying. There was a documentary made based on Chaos. I think it's called Chaos on Netflix. And again, in that documentary, O'Neill says, "Yeah, I think there's a connection somewhere in there, but I wasn't really able to make it." And to me, it's like, okay, it's a good book. I like learning about all three of these things, but I just don't see how they coalesce together that well. Like, what's the connection?
If it's not if there's not specifically, as Tom O'Neill seems to admit as well, a smoking gun that, say, Jolly West was in the same room with Charles Manson or something like that, wasn't the case though that he makes of the I forget the guy's name, but the probation officer for Manson just repeatedly, with no explanation, letting him off, and also having direct connections to CIA, and then even go back to Manson's times in juvenile, where he was in trouble and living in juvie hall, and there's evidence to say he was experimented on. Wouldn't that alone, without the Jolly West smoking gun scenario, point to a strong possibility that a hippie like Manson, who had a lot of pre-existing problems, was someone who clearly could have been targeted for a program like this, similarly to how they targeted, people with hookers in rooms behind, double-sided glass?
Yeah, it's possible, but it gets again to that question of what's more probable. So on that documentary, I don't know if this was in the book, but it's in the documentary, which I think it was a good inclusion. They interview one of the cult members. He was convicted of murder. It wasn't like Sharon Tate. It wasn't those murders.
Right.
It was before. It was a drug deal gone bad, I think it was. And Bobby Beausoleil, I think was his name. And they interview him, and he says, what was this all about? How did he get these people to, kill Sharon Tate and these, or why were they going to that place in the first place? He says, well, there was this guy who denied him like a recording contract or something like that, and he thought he lived there, and so he sent these people to kill them, and he wanted his underlings to go do it because Manson wanted them to get dirt on their hands so they would be subservient to him. He wanted to have dirt on them so that, they would be under his control even more. So to me, it seems like, well, that's kind of like a more probable explanation. That seems to happen a lot. Not necessarily in the same circumstances where, all these murders are going to happen, but yeah, people are going to manipulate other people and they hold a grudge against someone, and so they want to get retaliation. To me, that seems like the plausible explanation. The irony for me with Tom O'Neill is that he talks about Bugliosi's book and tears it apart and does a really good job at it, saying the reason why, Helter Skelter, this race war, Bugliosi apparently says that, Manson's wanting to spark this, and O'Neill thinks that Bugliosi did that so he could sell books. This is obviously very sensational. If Manson really did want to do that, then that's like the biggest story in the world. Then this is going to sell tons of books, and it did. It sold a ton of books. For me, the irony is that, O'Neill is making this connection to MKUltra, and to me, it seems like that's kind of sensationalizing it too. I think there's this more probable explanation, and I don't really see the connection. I don't think he's doing it because he's trying to sensationalize it to sell books. I think he's putting that in his book, even though there's not like that clear, direct evidence that there's a link, because he did all this research for 30 years or however long it was, and he kind of falls victim to the fallacy of sunk costs. I did all this research looking up this guy Jolly West because I thought there was a connection, and even though I didn't find a direct one, there still might be something there. So I don't want this to go into the scrap bin, so I'm going to put it in the book too.
Right.
So I don't think there was a nefarious intent in it. I think he's doing it because, hey, I did all this research and I want people to know what I was researching. And I like that part of the book, like the research and what he's doing, but I was just not convinced of the connection that he is drawing.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.